thank you everyone for joining us, and those joining us retroactively when this is not live anymore. We're broadcasting from Sipur Pashut. It's an independent bookstore in south of Tel Aviv in Neve Tzedek. We're in English because we're honored to have an international speaker and author with us, and international audience members. And hopefully this makes us really hopeful, and we're honored to host international events, and we think this is what makes this time and place in the history, in our history, kind of hopeful in that we can engage and swap ideas, and the more events like this, the merrier. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the screen around. I just wanted to give you context of where we're broadcasting from to Adam.
אוקיי, אז שלום וערב טוב לכולם. אנחנו נדבר במשך כמה דקות דברי פתיחה בעברית, ואז נחזור שוב לאנגלית. ברוכים הבאים לערב ההשקה לספרו של גיא סטנדינג, הפרקריאט, המעמד, המסוכן, החדש. לי קוראים אדם חפץ ואני עורך של המגזין פיגומים.
אני רוני כספי, אני חוקרת בקרן ברל כצנלסון.
אנחנו מדברים איתכם כאמור מהחנות סיפור פשוט שנמצאת בתל אביב, שמארחת אותנו גם פיזית וגם בזום. שנינו חברי, אני ורוני, חברים וחברי המערכת של סדרת הספרים בעברי, שיוצאת במסגרת קו אדום של הקיבוץ המאוחד. הפרקריאט הוא הספר השלישי בסדרה הזאת. שני הספרים הקודמים הם המינוטאור הגלובלי, מאת יאניס ורופקיס, וכלכלה ויקינגית של ג'ורג' לייקי. בעתיד הקרוב צפויים לצאת עוד ספרים של מריאנה מצוקטו, של תומה פיקטי ועוד רבים וטובים. הספר הפרקריאט, המעמד, המסוכן, החדש, פורסם לראשונה ב-2011. הוא יצא בעברית בסוף 2021, בתרגום הנהדר של יסמין הלוי, ולמהדורה הזאת יש הקדמה חדשה שכתב סטנדינג במיוחד למהדורת הקורונה, וגם פתח דבר שכתב למהדורה העברית פרופסור גיא מונדלק. את שלושת ספרי הסדרה אפשר להזמין באתר של סיפור פשוט, ולאסוף מהחנות או לקבל משלוח לארץ או לחול. אפשר גם להזמין את הספרים באתר הוצאת הקיבוץ המאוחד. כרגע יש עליהם הנחה, אז מומלץ להזמין אותם בקרוב. עוד מעט ישלח קישור לרכישת הספר, ואנחנו מפצירים בכם לקנות אותו. ככל שיהיו לספר הזה ולספרים האחרים בסדרה יותר קונים, ככה נוכל להוציא יותר ספרים בסדרה.
אנחנו רוצים להודות מקרב לב לכל הגופים והאנשים שהם חלק מסדרת בעברי, לגיורא רוזן מקו אדום והוצאת הקיבוץ המאוחד, שהיא האכסניה של הסדרה, למיקי דריל מקרן פרידריך אברט, לאביעד אומנר רוזנבלום מקרן ברל כצנלסון, לדודו אמיתי מיד יערי, לנטע שפירא ולדני גוטווין. הספרים האלה לא היו מתפרסמים בלי שיתוף הפעולה באמת יוצא דופן הזה בין גופים מהשמאל, ואנחנו באמת מאוד מאוד גאים ומאוד מאוד שמחים על שיתוף הפעולה הזה, מקווים לעבוד עוד הרבה שנים ולהביא לכם עוד הרבה ספרים. כמה מילים על איך הערב הזה ייראה. אנחנו נדבר עם פרופסור סטנדינג במשך כ3/4 שעה עד שעה, כשאנחנו מקווים שבחלק לקראת סוף הערב יהיה לנו זמן גם לשאלות מהקהל, אז אתם מוזמנים לכתוב שאלות כאן בצ'אט כדי שנרכז אותם לחלק הזה. אנחנו נדבר עם פרופסור סטנדינג כמובן על הספר, על הפרקריאט, אבל גם על התפתחויות רלוונטיות שקרו בעולם ובעולם העבודה מאז שהספר פורסם שלו, להתמודדות עם הבעיות והסוגיות שהוא מעלה בספר. Hello and very good evening to economist and writer Professor Guy Standing. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a very big honor and a great privilege to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
The subtitle of your book is The New Dangerous Class, and some reviewers of the book have claimed that working class people were always precarious, and therefore there's no need for a new categorization. So I'd like to ask what differentiates the precariat from the classic working class?
Okay, well, before I answer that, let me say thank you very much for publishing this in Hebrew. I am very proud of the fact that it's published in Hebrew. It's now the 25th language in which the book has been published. And that sort of thing does not happen to an ordinary economist. And it's transformed my life in the sense that since 2011, when the initial edition was published, it's now gone into 5 editions, I have been asked to give well over 500 presentations in 40 countries. Now that is an extraordinary situation. And every single day I receive emails from different countries, different age groups, all over, by people who say, this book is about me. This book is about my condition and how I live and have to survive. And when I hear people say there's nothing new about the precariat, I sometimes get angry, I sometimes smile. If you think about it, the proletariat didn't really exist globally until the middle of the 19th century. All the previous centuries, there was not a proletariat. It was something that Marxists looked at, quite rightly, in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And the proletariat had a distinctive pattern of work and labor. And it wasn't a matter of being precarious. The condition of labor throughout history has always had insecurity and instability. But the concept of precarity is different from that. The concept of precarity comes from the Latin, ancient Latin, to mean to obtain by prayer, to be a supplicant, to rely on discretionary favors or judgments by others in positions of authority. Now, the proletariat was habituated and conditioned proletarianization. They were habituated to expect and aspire to a life of stable labor, full-time labor, with a very clear set of social entitlements linked to the performance of stable labor. And during the course of the 20th century, a whole lot of rights, so-called rights, labor rights, developed to benefit the proletariat. Now, the precariat can be defined in 3 dimensions. It has distinctive relations of production. It is subject to unstable labor, insecure labor, a lack of occupational identity and narrative, a sense that they are not going anywhere with themselves through their life. For the first time in history, you have millions and millions of people who are expected to do labor that is below the level of their education and qualification. That was not the case with the proletariat of the 19th and 20th centuries. But the second identification of the precariat is they have distinctive relations of distribution. They do not rely on having access to non-wage benefits, pensions, paid holidays, paid leave. The proletariat received during the course of the last century. And this is a class in the making who is living on the edge of unsustainable debt all the time. They are experiencing chronic uncertainty, which is different from the old idea of the welfare state, which looked after contingency risks, the risk of unemployment, the risk of maternity, the risk of accidents, etc., where they were given state benefits. Today, the precariat know there is only one certainty, and that is uncertainty. They cannot expect to be able to deal with shocks. They don't have a sense of resilience, which we've seen during the course of the pandemic and in the austerity era before it. But the third dimension of defining the precariat is, to my mind, the most important. And the critics, the reviewers that you've mentioned, have ignored this part altogether. And that is the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. It is the first class, mass class of working people who have to rely on labor and work for their income to be losing rights, to be losing civil rights, to be losing social rights, to be losing cultural rights, to be losing economic and political rights. And they feel and are supplicants. And being a supplicant is a terribly undignifying situation. That's what defines the precariat today. So I think the interesting thing that's happened in the past 10 years is that the initial reaction, particularly by Marxist critics, who hadn't read the book, they had not read the book. Because if they had read the book, they would not have said that it's about precarity as insecure labor. It isn't. But younger people who have read the book in the past 10 years and the new editions, they understand the whole sense of being in the precariat. And that, I think, is very encouraging at this terrible time that we're facing at the moment.
So I'd like to ask about the second part of the subtitle, the dangerous part. You discuss the precariat's working and living conditions, and you arrive at the conclusion that the class is prone to xenophobia and racism. Why is this so? Why do you think the precariat's working conditions lead them to be so politically dangerous?
Well, let me to answer that one, because it's a very important question you've asked, Adam. The real sense of the precariat is that they're a dangerous class in the sense of the term that was used in the 19th century. It was a term that was used to describe those people who were not part of the proletariat and they were not part of the bourgeoisie. There were people who did craft work. They were independent craftsmen. They were street sellers. There were people who were outside the capitalist structure, who were not wedded to the ideology of the bourgeoisie or the ideology of the proletariat. They were dangerous because they were critical of the trends of proletarianization and were sense of independent. They wanted a progressive alternative. Now that is why I've used the term dangerous class. But it's dangerous in very specific sense. Those who've read the books, because there are two books, the Precariat and the Precariat Charter, will know that what I've done in the analysis is I've said that the precariat is a class in the making, not yet a class for itself. A class in the making knows what it is against, but has not yet articulated a clear message of what it wants instead. And the precariat, as it's developed in the last 20 years, consists of three groups. The first group are those who've fallen into the precariat and they feel they've lost the past. They've come from old working class communities and families, proletarians, if you like, and they feel they've lost that. This group wants the past back. And that is why they turn to populists like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Orban, or dare I say it, Putins of the world, who promise to bring back glorious past. There never was such a glorious past, but they play on the fact that this is the least educated part of the precariat. I said that in the middle of the last decade, that part would reach its peak as a share of the total. Because they're getting older. They're getting beyond being active. The second part of the precariat is what I call the nostalgics. These are the people who've lost a sense of the present. They've lost a now. They don't have a home anywhere. This group consists of migrants, consists of many women, it consists of ethnic minorities, of deprived religious groups. This group will not listen to the populist authoritarians of the far right, the fascists, but it will keep its head down and try to survive. This group is a dangerous class in the sense that it has to survive, and we do not want millions and millions of people feeling disenfranchised so that they don't participate in the political life of society. The third group in the precariat is what I call progressives. The first group has lost the past, the second group has lost the present, and this third group has lost a sense of the future. It's lost a sense that tomorrow will be better than today, and that I am going through my life developing myself, my friendships, my relations, my skills. They've lost the future. Of course, this is the most educated part of the precariat. This is the part of the precariat that mostly write to me from around the world, because they've lost a sense of the future. This part will not vote for populists. It will not vote for the far right, but it is looking for a new politics of paradise, a term I use in the book, as you know, a politics that is progressive, emancipatory, and a sense of reviving a way of living. And for my mind, we are now in a stage where, in the aftermath of the financial crash, 10 years of austerity, the pandemic, and this terrifying war, in the aftermath of all that, I believe the energy of that third group and the size of it will spell a new progressive political dawn. And for me, that becomes an exciting prospect.
So let me ask you, following that, you suggest that using our understanding of the precariat as a class, we should begin to articulate a new vocabulary or a new agenda for the left. What are the most important or the basic terms that you think that we need to define or to redefine in this vocabulary?
I like that question. Ronnie, I will try and give a short answer. I could give you a very long answer because I've tried to do that in another book called The Corruption of Capitalism. And in that book, I've said that we are living in an era where we don't have a free market system. Anybody who thinks that we have a free market system today is either an idiot or evil, because it's the farthest you can get from a free market system. It is a system of rentier capitalism, and we have to articulate what is the enemy before we can understand where the criticism should focus and where we should put our energies and our political action. If you think it's a free market system when it isn't, you're wasting your time. Now, rentier capitalism consists of a situation where more and more of the money and the income and wealth is going to the owners of property, physical property, financial property, intellectual property, and less is going to those who rely on labor and work. And that, for me, opens up an understanding of what sort of capitalism we have, because wealth inequalities have grown dramatically compared with income inequality. And the powers that go with the corruptions of rentier capitalism lead to circumstances where many of the elements that make the life of the precariat so difficult are getting almost impossible. And there is nothing out there which is stopping rentier capitalism getting worse. We have financialization unprecedented. We have levels of private and corporate and household debt that is unprecedentedly high. This is the context in which we need to look at. Now, one of the things we've got to reconceptualize, and that's why I think your question is so good, is the very concept of work. We have had a situation of the 20th century when all work that was not labor disappears. It disappears from our statistics, it disappears from our measures of national income, it disappears from our textbooks, it disappears from common discourse. So all the work that women in particular do that's unpaid, which is most valuable, has disappeared. It has no value. And the labor unions and the social democrats have played that line. They have concentrated on laborism, labor. But think of all the essential work that not only women do, but some men as well, not only in care work, caring for your children, caring for the elderly, caring for your community, acting in the commons, producing beautiful things that get zero value. We have to rescue the sense of work, and then we can revalue what it is we want to produce and what we value in terms of our national income measures, and get away from this crazy measure of GDP growth as measuring whether society is successful or not, because that way leads to the road to extinction, the ecological collapse that's coming towards us. We need to redefine growth. Whether you use the term degrowth or a revived sense of what it is we mean by development, whether you're a rich country or a poor country, we need to rethink that. And we also need what I've called in a new book, it's about to come out, a politics of time. We want to rescue time. And that means we have to reconceptualize what it is we are measuring when we talk of time. The ancient Greeks taught us that leisure is not just recreation. It's separate from recreation. Leisure meant to the ancient Greeks schole or skole, and it meant public participation in the life of the polis. And so far under capitalism, we have had civic privatization in the sense that everybody is spending more and more time either consumption or labor or work to help with labor, but have lost the capacity to be public citizens. Not everybody, but most people. They have become reduced to consumers of politics rather than participants. And we need to rescue that sense of leisure from the ancient Greeks and the sense of commoning, shared activities. You have had the famous kibbutz movement, but it's not only that form of commoning, it's the commoning of connecting with nature, sharing in nature. And I think that this transformational moment will give the precariat, which is not habituated to performing full-time labor and will not want that. They will want to revive a sense of work that is dignifying, emancipatory, useful, and socially useful. And I think these words are things that are where we should be pitching our vocabulary. Because at the moment, the old social democratic vocabulary and the old socialist vocabulary is all about labor. They want everybody to be in jobs, 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 jobs. Let us stop making a fetish of jobs. They're instrumental. I have never worked harder than since I stopped having a job. Most people want to work on their enthusiasms, on their creativity, on their being in a bookshop or whatever. Let us escape from jobism. I see you smile, and I hope that the smile is a smile of recognition, because that is what we want to do. We want to get away from this old social democratic nonsense. Being in a job is being in a position of subordination, subordination to a boss. What's so magical about that? I mean, the human being doesn't start life thinking, I must be in a job. It's crazy. So for me, we do need a new vocabulary, but the Precariat understands that. Labor unions don't seem to learn. And that's why often before the pandemic, whenever I gave a talk to a group on the Precariat, I could safely say that if I wanted to drive them all to rush to the nearest bar to have a beer, I would start talking about labor unions. Because they would say, labor unions don't do anything for us. Labor unions, we need unions. We need unions. Don't get me wrong, but the type of labor unions that we've had with old dinosaurs are no longer suited. We need a different form of union.
Okay, so you talk about changes. Let's talk about some of the changes in the world. Since the Precariat was published, which is more than 10 years ago, we had some major events and some significant processes taking place in the global labor market. We have the gig and the economy and the platform economies rising with governments and legislators all around the world trying to find solutions to these new workers, freelancers, non-workers. We obviously have the pandemic, which forced government and people, again, all around the world to rethink about questions such as who is an essential worker, how do you work from home, how do you deal with the immediate and unexpected halt of entire sections of the economy, and many other questions. And lately we had some economic trends that might imply some change or shift in the power balance of the labor market. I'm referring here to the unprecedented wave of strikes in the US that began in October last year. We also have a big wave of unionization. We have record numbers of people leaving their jobs, the Great Resignation. In what ways do these events affect the Precariat as a class?
Well, first of all, I think that all of those developments reflect the fact that the size of the Precariat has grown enormously around the world. In many countries, we're now talking about 40–50% of the total adult population who feel they are either in the Precariat or close to being in the Precariat. Most of the developments that you've mentioned, which I've discussed in the books, are a sign of globalization and the technological revolution that has been taking place around AI and automation. What we've got now is a globalized labor process in which it is almost impossible for conventional social democratic policies to raise the living standards of people who rely on labor and work for their income. One of the issues that has taken place that you didn't mention in your list, and I agree with your list, is that there has been a huge increase in the amount of work for labor relative to labor. If you think of labor as being that which you are given a wage, millions of people now have to do a lot of work for which they get no payment at all. Millions of people sit in front of their screens and do activities which feed in and give rental income to the big tech companies. We all know this story. Millions of people have to do more and more work for the state, for which they're not paid, but they have to do it, otherwise they don't get benefits or they don't get access to services and so on. And we're seeing a situation where we have a unique phenomenon, which is the migration of labor without the migration of the workers. That's never happened in history. It's never happened. But if you think about it, often if you pick up the phone or whatever and you call for a service, you may end up speaking to someone in Goa or Accra rather than in Manchester or Tel Aviv, because the labor is being supplied, but the person is there. And the same goes for a whole lot of online activities, including not just basic services, but highly sophisticated activities like legal work, like medical work, diagnostic work, a whole architectural things, a whole lot of forms of work that people used to say has to be done in the local community is now done far part of the world. And what this means is that there will be downward pressure on wages in Tel Aviv, in Manchester, in Geneva, everywhere, because more and more companies can just shift to where they want to produce. And many, many big companies have plants, have factories or headquarters in 30 or 40 countries, so they can switch it very quickly. Now, what this means is that the bargaining position of people who rely on labor is actually not very strong. And that leads to the big question you raised at the end, Ronnie, which is the Great Resignation. I think there's something very exciting about the Great Resignation, because I think it reflects a feeling a lot of people have developed during the pandemic. And it goes back to your previous question. They don't like jobs. People don't like jobs. And if they can find a way of being out of jobs, they will find it. Now, at the moment, I think it's too early to say whether this Great Resignation is a big long-term trend or a catching up phase where we just see a lot of elderly people taking early retirement, which has been one phenomenon in the United States, or is a fundamental challenge to laborism and jobism. I hope, obviously, it is the second. And I think there is a certain degree of wanting to escape from dependency on jobs, and therefore wanting to accept a lower income lifestyle, but one that you feel more in control of yourself and your time, your family, and your community. And I think that's exciting.
So my next question actually segues great from your last couple of sentences. And I'd like to ask you about what you call your politics of paradise, or what should be the precarious politics of paradise. You're pretty critical about the standard social democratic solutions to the precarious problem, and you're known as one of the main advocates of UBI, or Universal Basic Income. So I'd like to ask basically two questions. One is, what are the problems with those classic left-wing social democratic solutions? And why is UBI so central to your vision of politics of paradise?
Well, in a sense, I've been saying all evening, Adam, that why I dislike the old classic social democratic views. They want everybody to be in jobs. They want everybody to have secure labor. They want people to have full employment, and don't give value to the other activities I've talked about. When the crisis of social protection developed in the last 20 years of the last century, the social democrats of the world turned to means testing social assistance rather than their traditional views on national insurance or social insurance. What this meant was that they would target help on the poor, and they would target help on the deserving poor. So they adopted the language of the right in demonizing those people who were lazy, those people who were not deserving of state support. And they opted to go for means testing. Now, what means testing means is that I say to Ronnie, if you are poor, I want to measure how much income you get. I want to look at the measurement, decide or not whether you are poor, and then I will give you a benefit. Well, you automatically put someone in a poverty trap in those circumstances. Because if you try to become non-poor, you would lose the benefits. And therefore, you would face a marginal tax rate of 80% or 90%, as in many countries. That means the government resorts to measures to force you to take low-wage jobs. And that's exactly what's happened. So, you know, Clinton famously said we're going to end welfare as we know it. So he introduced term limitations. For me, this inevitably leads to workfare and to a coercive social policy. I've favored basic income since I finished my doctorate at Cambridge many years ago. And we set up BIA, and we have some distinguished Israeli members, and anybody can join. We have members all over the world now, thousands and thousands have joined. And what I believe is that an anchor of a new social protection system has to be based on everybody having access to a basic income. A basic income would mean a modest payment, regular, every month, paid to each individual, man, woman, equally, without conditions, without previous performance of labor being necessary, and without conditions that you have to behave in a certain way, you have to work in a certain way, etc., etc. And it would be your right. And the reasons I believe in a basic income are fundamentally ethical, not instrumental. Ethical in the sense it's a matter of common justice. If we allow for the private inheritance of private wealth, which is a lot of something for nothing, something that a minority receives, not for having done anything, just by luck. Don't tell me that giving a basic income is something for nothing, because it is a common dividend on the collective public wealth created by the many generations of Jewish settlers or whatever in your country, whichever country. The past has created our wealth. And we don't know whose ancestors contributed more or less. And that's why each of us should have a common dividend. And also to compensate for the fact that our commons, our land, our water, our air, our resources have been taken by individuals, by privileged groups. And we as commoners should say, there should be a compensation for the commoners who've been deprived. But a basic income would also give people a sense of basic security. Basic security is a human need. And the psychologists have taught us that if you're insecure, your mental bandwidth shrinks, your IQ goes down. A basic income, even if at a low level, increases a sense of basic security and improves mental capacities to make decisions. It makes people more altruistic and tolerant and so on. And it also enhances freedom, as I've argued in the book on basic income. And for me, this is an ethical justification for a transformation with supplements for people with disabilities and extra costs of living and so on. But it's a necessary part of a progressive agenda for the 21st century. Unless we realize that you need ex-ante protection, not ex-post compensation as the welfare state tried to do, ex-ante because we are facing a life of uncertainties and shocks, and the pandemics will continue. You and I do not know who will be vulnerable. We do not know who is going to be having that resilience. And a basic income, even if it's at low level, gives people a sense of resilience. I made a video with Massive Attack, the musical group, last July, and I argued that this is the fundamental reason for wanting a basic income. A basic income will give us individual and societal resilience, and that is vital.
We're standing today at the crossroads. The pandemic is hopefully behind us. The recovery is still ahead of us. We also have ahead of us the fight against the climate crisis and its implications. We just had a very alarming IPCC report published earlier this week. So I would like to ask, which direction should we go now to create a better world? And this is very big, so let me get a bit smaller. What social forces do you think can carry out these tasks? And what organizations or movements make you optimistic or hopeful about the future?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I hope I've tried to answer this question during the course of my previous answers. But let me add to that if I can, which is to recall the beginnings of the welfare state after the Second World War. And William Beveridge wrote a very influential report in 1942, in which he said the challenge ahead was to defeat 5 giants. And the 5 giants were disease, ignorance, squalor, want, and poverty. Today, I believe we are confronted with a challenge of defeating 8 giants. And the 8 giants, I believe, is where progressive politics should be concentrating their efforts. We need to defeat the giant of inequalities. We need to confront and have a politics that's deliberately confronting insecurity. We need a strategy for reducing the horrendous levels of debt that the Precariat and others face. We need a strategy for confronting the pandemic of stress. Stress is an enemy of progressive thinking, and we need to tackle it. We need it badly to defeat it. And then there is precarity, the sense of turning people from being supplicants into feeling and being full citizens with rights, equal rights, cultural rights, social rights, civil rights, economic and political rights. And then we need a strategy for confronting the robots. I believe the robots will not make us all redundant so we have nothing to do. On the contrary, I think they're generating more work, not less. But undoubtedly, the technologies and AI and robots and so on are increasing the inequalities, and we need a strategy for sharing the benefits of automation. Then the 7th giant is the giant that I believe will turn millions more around the world into the threat of extinction, the threat of global warming, of pollution, the loss of our commons, the threat which is posed by extreme wealth, causing far more of the pollution and global warming than the poor. And we need a strategy which says, okay, we need high carbon taxes. We need them because we need to confront this despite the current circumstances that we all know because of the war and other reasons. We need carbon taxes to wean people off relying on fossil fuels. There's only one problem with eco-taxes, and that is by themselves, they are regressive. They tend to increase inequality because a poor person spends a higher percentage of their income than a rich person in those taxes. And the only way to make them politically acceptable and progressive is to guarantee that the revenue from those taxes is recycled in the form of common dividends or basic income. And the eighth giant is the giant that I'm sure you understand better than most people. And that is the fear of neo-fascist populism. We have a world which is playing on fears. We have a world where millions and millions of people are living in fear and insecurity. And as I mentioned earlier, many of those people will listen to authoritarian people promising to bring back some disgusting, glorious past and blame migrants, blame Jews, blame Muslims, blame women, blame the disabled, blame some group. This is a horrifying attitude. And the fact that it exists in the scale it does in the 21st century, after all the world experienced in the 20th century, is one of the saddest things for all of us. And unless we have a strategy for giving people basic security, a feeling of belonging, that fear must continue. And therefore, I believe that our strategy as progressives is to say we must defeat all of those giants. A basic income by itself will not defeat all those giants, of course not. But we need a collective strategy. We need new organizations who are committed to dismantling the structures that are producing those eight giants. So that is my basic message. And I thank you for your highly articulate questions. They're good ones. And I've had many worse, I can tell you.
So we'd like to move now to the Q&A part. We had some questions in the chat, which I'll try and translate to the best of my ability. And we invite whoever wants, if we'll have enough time to send some more questions in the chat. So one of the questions is about UBI and the global North and South. And the question is, isn't a UBI a global North solution which deepens the inequalities between the global North and global South?
Well, thank you for the question. You're listening to a man who's had the dubious distinction of having piloted basic income in 4 continents over the last 25 years. And we did a big pilot in Africa. We did a big pilot we did 3 pilots in India. And the results of the pilots where we provided everybody with a basic income that was quite low by subsistence standards in those countries. And the results were overwhelming in the sense that it resulted in improvements in nutrition, improvements in health, improvements in schooling, attendance and performance, improvements in sanitation, improvements in women's status, improvements in income distribution, and had a multiplier effect so that the output went up. And in every single pilot, including pilots in Canada and the United States and Britain, in Finland, in every single pilot in which I've been involved, and I'm now advising on 3 current pilots, the amount of work that people do has gone up, not down. Contrary to the prejudices of people who think that if you had basic income security, you would become lazy and stop working, that is prejudice. People want to work. They want to improve their lives. And having a basic income gives people a sense of energy, of confidence, of involvement. And we have seen the results being increasing work, increasing care, increasing volunteering. And for me, this isn't a north-south thing. It can be done in any country, can be afforded. Every developing country spends over 6% of their GDP in subsidies that go to rich individuals and rich corporations. If you diverted that money, or even part of it, you could provide every citizen in that country with a basic income. And for me, it is as affordable in India as it is in any other country. And it is affordable in your country as well. So I will not tolerate those who say it's an unaffordable dream.
Okay, so I'd like to move to one last question, which I know you address in your book, but I'll ask it anyway, and that's the relation between UBI and decommodification. And the question is, isn't UBI a deeper commodification than what we're already living in? Isn't it the logic of the welfare state is decommodifying services, decommodifying some goods? And when the UBI essentially does, that's the claim, I'm sure you know this kind of line of thought, is deepening the commodification of the labor market and in general of social life.
Okay, let me answer that. First of all, you must make a distinction between labor and labor power, the Marxist distinction. Labor power is the capacities of any individual. Labor is the activity. I used to argue with my old friend Espen Andersen about this issue. The Social Democrats in the 20th century decommodified labor, but didn't decommodify people as labor power. What they did is they shifted from money wages to more and more non-wage benefits and state benefits. But to get those, you had to perform labor, or you had to be married to someone who was performing labor, or have parents who was performing labor. This was a form of labor power commodification, but labor decommodification. Now you come to basic income. A basic income would decommodify the person. It would give you the ability to step out of the labor market. You are not market dependent on survival. The higher the level of basic income, the more decommodified you are. I don't mind if labor, the activity, the performance of labor with a boss is fully commodified. You know, it's got a price. It's called the wage. It's commodified. To pretend that it's decommodified when you rely on a wage is ridiculous. It's a price. It's commodified. But we want to decommodify ourselves so that if we had a basic income, I could say to my elderly neighbor, right, I'm going to help you in the next few days because I can afford to give my time because I'm a decommodified person. And for me, we need to realize that in the 21st century, freedom, in the Republican tradition of freedom, will mean more than the ability of just saying no to being exploited. It will mean the ability to avoid being a supplicant, the ability to have full freedom. And that means being able to step out of the market. You can't do that if you're relying on labor, just on wages, and you get no guarantee income. The income has come from dismantling rentier capitalism along the lines I've talked about in the book, but that is decommodification. I believe freedom is decommodification.
So if it's okay with you, there's another, we had some questions pouring in. So I'd like to ask one question that I'm also personally interested in. Is that okay? Just one more
question. One more question. Then, okay. then I'll collapse.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the question is, what's the role of national economy and national union, workers' unions in the reality of a global precariat, the tension between the two?
Well, as I said earlier, I believe that labor unions must transform themselves. If you look back historically to ancient China, and then through to Italy in the Middle Ages and all the way through the world, you see that for a long time, the collective organization of working people was the guilds, the professional and occupational guilds. They were overtaken by first craft unions who looked after craftspeople, and then eventually at the beginning of the 20th century, by labor unions who fought for laborers and wanted to put labor on a pedestal. As I've indicated in my previous answers, that model of laborism is dated. It's no longer progressive. It was progressive at that time, of course it was, but it is not progressive now. What we need today is collective bodies that fight for the values of work and commoning and leisure and the environment, who want to change the nature of growth, who don't want to push everybody into full-time stable jobs. The unions must either become more ecological or we will look for different types of organization. I once addressed a meeting, secret meeting, a summer school of international trade union leaders, very distinguished people from their national trade unions. And I said to them, why is it that trade union leaders like yourselves are the most vehemently against a basic income? At that point, the chairperson said, oh, we'll stop for a coffee break. And then when we came back from the coffee break, he said, well, we'll move on to the next subject. And the trade unions leaders all started shuffling their papers, but an Italian trade union leader stood up and said, wait. I think we should answer Guy's question. Why are we against people having a basic income? And I think the reason, he said, is that if people had a basic income, they wouldn't join trade unions. And I looked at him and I said, if you think about that, that is amoral. It means you want people to be insecure and fearful because then they'll join. I said, but also, fortunately, you are wrong. People who have basic security are more likely to join bodies that are fighting for rights, fighting for a better society, fighting against extinction, etc. And the unions have to move away from their old model of laborism. Tell me how often, when the question has arisen about a campaign, whether it's jobs in building some buildings or something versus environmental safety, which way have the trade unions voted? They voted for jobs, not for the ecology. That's demonstrated again and again and again. For a long time, they were not helping with women's rights. They're trying to make up with it recently, but still they don't recognize and help care workers, the precariat. And they've got to change. But I don't want to end by you thinking that I'm against collective unions. I'm not. We need them. We need collective voice. We really do. And we need it more than ever. But the unions have got to change.
Thank you so much for joining us and answering our not so bad questions.
Very good question.
So
very
well.
Good. Very good question. I hope the book is interesting to people. I always ask people when a book is published in a language, I ask somebody, is it a good translation? Does it reflect the original? So I very much hope the first Jewish speaking friend I meet, I will ask him that. But I hope the book does well. And thank you very much.
He'll tell you the same. It's an excellent
translation. Good.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Good luck to you all. Good luck to you all.
תודה רבה לכל מי שהיה איתנו הערב, מקווים שנהנתם, מפצירים בכם שוב לרכוש את הספרים המצוינים כדי שנוכל להמשיך להביא לכם עוד מהם. לילה טוב.
לילה טוב, להתראות.